We have one more speaker before lunch, the other family member. When I think of the Annales School of Local History in France, I think of Pythian Adams, I think of Hoskins. That's local history to me. And that Adams, I think of Hoskins. That's local history to me, and that's where I come from actually now. Well, when I think of local history in Ireland, I think of Dr. Ray Gillespie. Many of us here in this room studied, myself and Brian and Peter and others, did our degrees, and went on, in Brian's case, to doctorates in Newport with the direction of Ray Gillespie. I think he's made more contribution to local history in Ireland than anybody. Looking down, looking at the big picture, and at the same time seeing the little pieces, that the jigsaw that needed to be put together. And he's helped so many of us. For me to introduce Ray to talk to you now.
Thanks very much, Joe. As always, Joe's reflections, his particular view of the truth. But with that reservation, let us, as they say, pass on. I have been put on the programme to talk about Mayo 1500, to talk about Mayo 1500 to 1700. And this is, I'm afraid, a task which is well beyond me. For many reasons, I wouldn't dare try to talk about a place which was described by Samuel Lewis in the 1830s as a various country. That is, a country of great variety, where there is, in one sense, no male, no single male. There are at least two males. There is the male of the northwest, the seemingly peripheral, and the quintessentially Gaelic world of the northwest. And then there is the male of southeast Mayo, much better land, although perhaps that's arguable in cases, but certainly much better land, much denser settlement, something much of the Irish Midlands or even the world of the East. So Mayo is a very diverse country. So we of course are standing here in that part of the northwest that what is sometimes seen as a quintessentially Gaelic world, as the Gaelic world pushed westward. So its residual place seems to be up in northwest westward. So its residual place seems to be up in northwest Mayo. And this was seen to be Irish speaking, particularly in tune, shall we say, with the Middle Ages. I'm going to try and lower the scale a little bit and to argue that perhaps this is not to try and reduce the scale down from the whole of Mayo, and I suppose to the world of the parish of Burrishoole in the same period, to try to see can we get some handle on the sort of processes which are underway in this, which created this world of northwest Mayo, this apparently quintessentially Gaelic world. And the reason I'm going to do this is because this world of northwest Mayo was, a world which was undergoing in the 1500s and the 1600s, a period 1500s and the 1600s, a period of very radical change. If you can imagine yourself back to 1500, it's really quite a difficult thing to do. There are no towns, there are no money. There are no markets. The ways in which people fit into society, the ways in which people fit into society are really very different. But yet, by 1700, we have something which is recognisably modern. We have the beginnings of towns, Newport, Westport. We have the emergence of a commercial economy, using coin in a way that was never the case before. In other words, we're seeing a revolution in this one parish over quite a long period of time. And if I were, in Ulster, say, or if I were in Munster, I would say, oh, this is to do with plantation. This is to do with English settlers. Paddy talked earlier on about obliterating this older Gaelic world and squeezing it out. But in fact, of course, as you know, there was no plantation in Mayo. I mean, there is nothing in Mayo comparable to the plantation of Ulster or to the plantation of Munster, or indeed to the plantations in the Irish Midlands. Mayo is somewhere that seems to achieve revolution by evolution, rather than revolution by some form of external interference. There's, until the 18th century, relatively little English settlement in Mayo. Until the 18th century, relatively little English settlement in Mayo. John Brown, who we've heard of before, describes himself as the first Englishman in the memory of man to settle in Mayo. In fact, of course, as Paddy pointed out, he wasn't English at all. He was from Westmeath, in the parish of Burrishoole. We have this enigma of apparently revolution, but yet without the dynamics of revolution that work elsewhere in the forms of plantation, colonisation, and all the rest of it. So how did that happen, I think, is my question. So I want, first of all, to try to say something about what the parish of Burrishoole was like around, let's say, 1500, or certainly in the 16th century. Then to say what it was like, say, about 1700, so we can get a sense of what changes had taken place. And then thirdly, to try and explain this enigma of change, to try and explain the way in which the parish of Burrishoole was transformed in the 17th century. What were the mechanics of change over those years? So if we start then, what did Burrishoole look like? What was it like around 1500? And of course, the obvious place, to start is this, which you've already seen. This is, of course, John Brown's map of Mayo of 1585. John Brown of the Neil, who is in fact, yes, the ancestor of the Browns of Westport House, who comes from the bridge in Athlone in 1570. We start to see a drift of families from the Irish Midlands, of old English families, into Mayo, picking up all sorts of goodies along the way. Not colonisation by Englishmen, but an internal colonisation, so to speak, from people from the east moving in to the west. And Brown is one of those. He acquires the Castle of the Neil. You know where that is. He acquires the Castle of the Neil, and under the Neil, you know where that is. He acquires the Castle of the Neil, and under the influence of Sir Richard Bingham, who is the governor of Connaught, I don't think he personally, but he arranges to have this map of Mayo made. And you can see here we are in the parish of Burrishoole. There's Achill. We are roughly somewhere in here. This is Newport, or where Newport roughly is, and then Westport, of course, down here. And you can see the sort of things that Brown was recording, the way that he was trying to put on paper. As Paddy pointed out to you earlier on, clearly what he is recording is the counties, the baronies, the administrative structure, in other words, of how the world was working. He's recording the physical, the mountains, partly because this is made, remember, in 1585. This is before the great Elizabethan wars of the late 1580s and particularly 1590s. So this is obviously military information. The physical landscape is military. Information. The names of the baronies and so on is administrative information, which anybody who is involved in the administration of Connaught through the presidency system, as Brown was, would need to know where are we. And thirdly, what else does you recover? Now, what you can't see very well, but you can see there is this nice handwriting here, in what we describe as italic hand, but you can see someone else, and whether it's Brown or his map maker, with other forms of writing, and he has also recorded on it the principal churches. Now, what these other names are about is they are essentially family names. They are names of the people who lived in that area. Okay? Now, they are names of the people who lived in that area. Okay? Now, you might think that's rather odd. Why would you note down the names of the families who lived in this area? After all, would it not make more sense if Brown was a man who was involved in local administration, down the names of townlands or the names of administrative divisions, which were the sort of things he would need to have known, particularly after 1585 when the composition comes in, and the composition essentially is not about land ownership, it's more about taxation. But you needed to know about taxation or that. But therefore, why record the names of families living there? And why record principal churches, and in some cases castles? And part of the reason seems to be that if we are thinking about how people are thinking about land being owned not by individuals but by families, but by groups of people, right? So that our idea that somehow land is owned by an individual, that there is a great landed estate, like the Browns of Westport, is in fact one of the products of this revolution, like the Browns of Westport, is in fact one of the products of this revolution. This is not the case in the early part of the 16th century. We don't have great estates all over Ireland. We have land held by individual families, and we'll see this in a moment or two. And these families have the way in which these families articulate themselves is they're not drawn into a market economy, although there are some forms of markets, and part of the reason why the churches are recorded is that churches seem to have been centres for fairs. The markets, as you know, happen every week with great regularity. Fairs only happen once a month, or maybe once a year, or maybe twice a year at the very most, and they are mainly for exchanging livestock. So that, and we do have passing references certainly. So if you have a church dedicated to St. Columcille, then you know the market would be held, or the fair would be held on that day. The other thing, of course, Brown does not record is roads, because roads, in essence, didn't exist. There are trackways, were very significant. But even more important was the sea. The sea is a way of moving around. And in particular here, certainly at the end of the 17th century, people like Downing talk about the road between Westport and Newport. And Newport is one of the worst in this country. He said, the worst in this island. Some may say that little has changed, but still, so that people think not by thinking about going from A to B, going from market to market, but they think about the sea, and they think about moving their goods by sea, and also buying and selling not necessarily on land, but at sea. And we know, for example, the Spanish, in the 15th century, this area is undergoing boom. How do we know that? Well, the annates that were paid to Rome, when a priest comes into a church for the first time, we can see those in the 16th century going up and 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 up. So there is a need, and we can see this in the landscape with the buildings, the Franciscans building friaries. We can see this in the landscape with the buildings, the Franciscans building friaries, for example, and the creation of stone buildings in the landscape, which are the things that Brown is portraying on his map. So this is a landscape economic boom. What is funding the boom? And in particular, the Spanish fishing. The Spanish fishermen are coming up, fishing off the west coast of Ireland, and the various great landed families, or the great lordly families, not landed, but the great lordly families, like the O'Donnells, and like the Burkes in Mayo are making. So money is flowing around in a very different way, the way we think of money flowing. Okay, so Brown's map gives us hints that this, in fact, is a very different world. It's not a market economy. It's what we might describe as a redistributive economy, where there are families own their lands. Families are grouped together for protection purposes under the great lords, and they pay the lord for protection. Now we can see this. How does this system actually work? Well, we can see how this system works. If you look at some of the written descriptions, system works. If you look at some of the written descriptions of Mayo and the areas around Burrishoole in particular, in the late 16th century. This is one. This country contains all the land of William Arthur, and the lands of country contains all the land of William Arthur, and the lands of O'Malley's, Clandonald's, MacMorris, MacJordan, McCostello, and there are various others missing. This country hath in the sea certain islands, fertile and most commodities of shipping. The sea, very important. For which purpose both, this is what I was saying about the importance of the sea and the importance of the maritime economy, but a rather different sort of economy than the one we're used to. Most part of this county is possessed by the Burkes, whose captains they commonly call MacWilliam. There are many of the names stout men able to make in times past before the war, and so any of them, the war he's talking about is the 9 Years' War. 1,500 for the rest of the country is inhabited by MacJordans, McCostellos, and the rest above specified, who will be dependers upon MacWilliam, and in a manner his vassals. This is what I was describing to you. People like MacWilliam doesn't own Mayo. The people who own him doesn't own Mayo. The people who own Mayo are the families, the Jordans, the McCostellos, Morrises, and various others, and they pay to MacWilliam Burke a render, right, and care for his protection, legal services, and protection. They're wholly out in rebellion. This is in the 9 Years' War, saving one principal man called Tippet Nalong. And Tippet Nalong is Granuail's son. Very good. There are no towns in this country of any, but many good havens and fair castles belong to the gentlemen. They're all named. So the chief is Castlebury, Ardnaree, Billy, and the castle of blank belong, and that blank is in fact, guess what? Burrishoole. Belonging to the Earl of Ormond. And we'll come back to Burrishoole and its importance in a moment. So that's the sort of image of Mayo. That's of this, if you like, this alternative world, this world very different to the world we live in, where there are dependencies, there are gift-giving relationships, rather than the prices being determined by the market, such as rent and so on. But this is a very different sort of world. This is a world of a gift economy, rather than a buy and sell economy, so to speak. Okay. Now, how does that actually work when we get down to this in detail? Well, we know a little bit. There are some descriptions of how this works. And I mean, perhaps the most famous one is the description which is put together in 1585 for the process of making the composition of Connaught. Now, we won't get into detail of composition taxation to fund the army in and to marginalise the military power of the great lord. And this meant taxing individual people who were on the land. And this is how they describe who owns the land, or who has the land of Burrishoole. In Burrishoole, there's a quantity of land belonging to the sept of Clanfilbin. Now, these are the local names, and interestingly, I was listening both last night and this morning when you were talking about names. I didn't see any of these names from the 16th century still being mentioned. Okay, so the question is, what happens to these local names? Clanfilbin consisting of 24 quarters. There is belonging to Clangibbons, Sebdut MacTibbet in the Burks, quantity of land consisting of 16. Sebdut MacTibbet in the Burks, quantity of land consisting of 16 quarters. Notice not acres, nothing like that, it's 16 quarters, 16 pound lands. Then there's land belonging to the Archbishop of Tuam, land belonging to the Earl of Ormond, there's land belonging to the Clonfilgrims again. This is land which is owned by families. The family owns all 24 of those lands. They don't have any deeds. We don't have any deeds. In the way we would think about an English common law system which would have deeds, which would have paper. We see that by the end of the 16th century, they're beginning to invent deeds, as we would understand it, but they have no deeds. How do you know that this is my land? Because my father held it, his father held it. Hence the importance of genealogy in this world. Incredibly important is genealogy in this world. But this is a word which is land is held by families. Families are continually jockeying for power within the family. Branches of the family are jockeying for power within, and they are rising and falling depending on the sorts of shenanigans which are going on within families. Different world to the world of the great estate and the world and the commercial world of the early 18th century. How does this actually work in practice? Well, we know quite a lot about this because in 1641 we have evidence which was gathered a little bit later in the late 17th century, and here you have descriptions for Burrishoole parish, and that probably won't sharpen, but you can see that this makes the same point, but much more precisely than how the composition of Connaught was making. It. In other words, there is 4 quarters, and there are the individuals all making up one family, right? All having one surname or being related in some way to another, right? So land is being held not as we understand it by individual holdings, but rather by this whole group of people. It's land holding by a group, land holding by a family. Okay, so this is a rather different sort of world, where this world has not so much lordship over land, with a common law system, with deeds, with leases. Rather, what is in short supply in this world is not land, it is men, it's people. So therefore, land is something which, don't get worked up about, because there's plenty of it, and you can have whatever you like. What is short are people to settle on that land. And hence that explains one of the reasons why raiding goes on so frequently in Gaelgarn. It's not to annex property, it's to pull more people in. And this is why the spin doctor within the greater Lord part is so important. He is there to convince. He is there to write poetry to convince these followers that his followers are the best people in the world. His Lord is the great. MacWilliam is the greatest Lord in the world. His Lord is the great. MacWilliam is the greatest Lord in the world. And these are all gathered together in the family book of the Dúnra, which is most famous in Mayo is, of course, the Seanachas Burka, the story of the Burks, which collects together poetry praising the Burks, saying, the Burks are the only people who can look after you. So this implies, of course, that rather than a nice settled landscape, which you might expect, lots of landowners, the landscape is pulsing, boundaries are changing all the time, power relations are shifting. By the end of the 17th century, this is a world which is starting to show signs of strain. Now, how do we know that? Well, first of all, we know it, yes, because we start to see signs of what we might describe as an English common law system over the use of land coming in, with, for example, people making deeds writing things down rather than simply remembering them. To get at the end of the 16th century, very end of the 16th century, and this is one of the earliest ones, we get a couple of deeds which survive in Westport House Archive, which have a provenance which is Irish and Gaelic, and this is where land is being conveyed from one of these families to another. In other words, land is still being held by families, but now they're starting to think, well, by what right do I hold this land? Well, it's not necessarily memory, it's not necessarily my genealogy, it's I have a piece of paper. Or parchment actually tell you? Well, it tells us that if you look at the translation here, I don't know if you can read it at the bottom, and what does it say? It says, the purpose of this deed is to make known. The purpose of this deed is to make known the agreement between Richard Burke MacRichard and Manus and Mayon. In other words, this is not a deed as we would understand. You would understand, you get a document, and that document confirms your title. Here, and so therefore the deed has been done. I mean, the agreement is in the piece of paper. In this case, that's not the case. Okay? It is that the purpose of this deed is to make known. The agreement has been fixed. The point of writing it down is simply to make it known. Okay? So what we have here, if you like, is a two-layered word. We have a word which is very traditional in lots of ways, which is still an oral word, which is still about remembering, and because your father had it, okay? These are the people who make agreements, okay? But then somebody says, but it's much more modern to write it down because that makes it known. That preserves it forever. So you can see change beginning to creep in at the end of the 17th century. Not as a result of plantation, but to creep in the end of the 17th century. Not as a result of plantation, not as a result of colonization, but rather change is creeping in among the Gaelic world, most of whom are illiterate. In other words, they make marks rather than signing things, so they're marks rather than signing things, so therefore they're not used to a literate world. Okay? But they're beginning to pick up new ideas from somewhere, from an English common law tradition. Now, so the question is, where are they starting to pick up these ideas from, and how are they starting to pick them? Okay, so let's just keep that idea in our heads about things beginning to change, and beginning to change by borrowing ideas from elsewhere rather than having them imposed by colonization or on you. Let's go to the end of the 17th century now and have a look at the word. And this is, Paddy's already shown you this. I mean, this is Petty's Hibernia Delineatio from the 1670s, from the 1680s. Petty's Atlas of Ireland, same area. I mean, here we are again, and Westport somewhere down there, and Newport will be somewhere. Westport somewhere down there, and Newport will be somewhere up there. Westport is beginning to emerge at this stage. And as Paddy pointed out to you, what do they record on their maps now? In the late 17th century, they record on their maps now not the names of families, not the principal castles, because that word has rapidly disappeared in the course of the 17th century. Now they are recording what are essentially townland names. They're recording administrative divisions, administrative structures. And you can see again, they're recording baronies, they're recording paddies, so now the landscape is no longer one which is parcelled out among families. Now the landscape is one which is parcelled out in townlands, and those townlands can be assigned to an individual. So we're getting, and that, by what right will that individual hold his lands? No longer will he say, because my grandfather held it. He will say, because I have a lease, I have a document. And the rise of estate collections, the Westport collection, by far the finest, is the ultimate example of that. It is that idea of the lease, the ultimate example of that. It is that idea of the lease taking over, the document taking over from the oral tradition, if you like, which you're seeing very dramatically in the 17th century. And it's the idea that underpins the sort of things which Petty wants to record on his map. This is what we looked at before. That is the old world, the world of families holding lands, all related one to another, holding these lands. But what has happened by the 1680s, all gone, replaced now by big estates. Oh, you say it's colonisation. Until you look at the names here. Lord Mayo. Who is Lord Mayo? He's a Burke. He is Granuaile. By that stage, I think is the great-grandson. There's been three of them. Lord Mayo, Lord Mayo, Lord Mayo, Lord Mayo. I mean, he's all over the place. Again, you can look. In other words, the people who are doing this, who are the beneficiaries of this change, and who are driving this change, are not necessarily people from outside. I mean, again, not necessarily people from outside. I mean, again, we've seen the Earl Ormond before. He's at exactly the same position. The Ormonds get the land in Burrishoole, in the 13th century, and are there ever since. We'll come back to them in a minute or two. Okay, so we begin to see, therefore, quite a dramatic change in the course of the 17th century, and quite dramatic in mentality, in how the world is organised, and in how society is structured in the course of the 17th century. How does this happen? How do some of these older families collapse? What is the thing that undermines the McGibbons and the various others around? And we get a clue to that in the late 1630s, at a time when Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, is talking about a plantation of Connaught, a plantation which never happens, of course. But as part of that plantation process, there are surveys made of who owned what, where, and when, which are actually very useful. And here we have part of the one for the Barony of Burrishoole. And you can see here are the old families, Richard McGibbons of Ballygock, who owned a carton. But what has happened? I actually had to mortgage that property. Okay? Now, interestingly, that is something that could not have been countenanced under the old world, where a family would, one individual within a family would alienate family property. And that was not all. Okay? If you alienated the whole lot. The breakup of this family unit, and he's alienating it for money, £6 sterling. And he's alienating it, and some of these people are alienating it to David Moyler, to Walter Blake. Walter Blake is a Galway merchant who is buying into land, as lots of the Galway merchants did in Mayo, and also Lord Mayo, Burke. Okay? So what is happening is the small men are being squeezed. Now why are they being squeezed? Well, there are various reasons why they're being squeezed. One is this commercialisation of the economy which is going on. And not only that, but significantly 1625, 1630, 1627, 1625, it happened. You would see it's happening in very bad years. Okay, so what happens is that there is a very bad year, like 1630. Harvest fails, there isn't enough, people need money. Some of the smaller men are being pushed to the side, and who, of course, rides into their men are being pushed to the side, and who, of course, rides into their rescue? Yes, it's Burke, who's ready to pick up, and he does it most spectacularly in the 1640s. when, of course, war breaks out in Ireland, and Burke in particular rides to the rescue, as he sees it, of lots of the small landmen off their land and absorbing it into, and it's in the 1640s that the large estate, Burke builds up a large estate in Mayo that later will, of course, was sold to the Browns, Westfield House. So the world is gradually changing. It's gradually changing. It's not a revolutionary change. And we can see lots of these new people who are coming in. Robert Downing, for example, described it in 1684. What is happening in the late 16th century is that families like the Ormonds, I mean, he talks here specifically about Ormond, for example, and how Ormond had got this land when they got it in the 13th century, but since Queen Elizabeth's time, i.e. things have perked up now in the late 16th century, they're beginning to see possibilities. And what is guess what, ironworking at a place called, guess where, Furness. That's where the name comes from. It's the late 17th century name. They're establishing iron, and how are they getting the resources in to establish this ironworking? Where are they getting the specialist skills from? Well, we know they're getting the specialist skills from. Well, we know this because of a letter from 1687 which says that Ormond had brought down men from the north. That Ulstermen were established in the Ools, which is Burrishoole, in the Ools, to set up this ironworking operation. This is part of this modernisation of the economy which goes on in the early 17th century. So not with new people coming in, but with old landlords seeing opportunities which are opening up and moving in and bringing in specialist skills. On the butlers, you know, how from the mid-16th century they're getting moving again. It's, I think, symptomatic of all of this. And the family who is most important for this is, of course, the Burkes. It's, of course, Gráinne Whale and her immediate family. Here we think of the Burkes, and, you know, that comment in 1598 said, you know, the Burkes were Gaelic families all in rebellion against the crown and so on. Well, you know, we shouldn't Gaelicize the Burkes too much. Right? There's some evidence, I think, to suggest that the Burkes, in fact, saw themselves as much more English than as Irish. And one of the most important pieces of evidence is that document that I mentioned earlier on, the Seanachas Burcan, the Book of the Burkes, which it has the poetry in it, yes, but also has tracts on land ownership in Latin, and also very uniquely has a series of images, which there are no parallel to this in any Gaelic manuscript of the Middle Ages of the 16th century. Okay, and they have images in them. They are creating images of the family and also religious images. Now, I'm just going to show you one. This is some of the religious images. Now you ask, and we saw that Burke is one of these modernizers. So where does his modernizing ideas come from? Okay, well if you look at where does his modernizing ideas come from? Okay, well if you look at the Seanachas Burcan, stylistically, this is this dates fairly precisely about 1572. Stylistically, this is very has parallels in Germany, which are of devotion that comes in the late 16th century, and also these sort of figures are very typical of the sort of prints that you get, these sort of prints you get in continental Europe at about the same time. Now, therefore, perhaps the Burkes are picking up their ideas not from the English, but are disposed towards these ideas, but also picking them up from the Spanish, from the French, from the people who are trading off the west coast of Ireland. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is, and also in one other way, and this is one of the images is the flagellation of Christ. what is really very interesting about this is there is no these thousands of little read parallel in Irish language texts about the number of wounds of Christ and the 100 Christ. So there's a strong Irish component. The thing which is paralleled in no Irish text is devotion to the pillar on which Christ was whipped. Okay? That doesn't appear in bardic poetry, in religious literature, in anything else. Okay? Not appear in bardic poetry, in religious literature, in anything else. Okay? Now, where is that pillar? Well, that pillar is very simply in Rome, where it still is to this day in the church, up beside the St. Mary Majors. In other words, had someone, and it is almost identical, the one which is there today, almost, in other words, whoever drew this. So who is moving backwards and forwards between the Burkes and Rome? Hey, what about the nice Franciscans who are hanging about in the various abbeys along the North Mayo coast? Possible. Again, if you remember the King's Common Law tradition, if we went back, and you'll see how it starts. IHC Maria, religious invocation. In other words, the churchmen, as anything else, canon lawyers. They understand about writing things down. And it's no accident that many of these early deeds in Irish, in fact, are associated with religious foundations. So that Maynooth, the McRanald deed, it's the seed of the convent. The McRanald deed, it's the seed of the convent of the College of Maynooth, of the Chantry Chapel at Maynooth, which is applied to the deed because none of the parties have a seed. Okay? So there, again, in Cavan, that early deed for there it is the Franciscan deed. Even these deeds are secular, but they nearly always have an ecclesiastical context by someone who understands law, who understands writing, who understands seals, and who has a seal. So is this, when we talk about modernisation in the 17th century, is it coming from England or is it coming from somewhere much, much wider, much wider? Okay? Filtering in not east-west, but paradoxically perhaps even west-east in Ireland, landing on the west coast of Ireland in Mayo, with these sort of ideas coming from continental Europe and filtering down through. But there clearly is an English component. To the Burkes. The Burkes are clearly at this sort of crossroads. And if you look at the image of the knights, these are the Burkes. They're the ancestors of Tilly the Long and the family, as they wish to portray themselves. And they portray themselves. The Irish didn't wear armour. Okay? I mean, like the Irish, these people are being portrayed as English knights. Okay? So these people are pulling ideas from England, from wider continental Europe, and introducing them into the parish of Burrishoole. Is revolution by evolution. There you are.
We have one more speaker before lunch.